Okay, thanks. I appreciate it. So the last limitation I see of the existing ways that we think about receiving communities, it tends to not distinguish between two things. So on the one hand, the characteristics of places that might make them better destinations, so the things like environmental characteristics, like access to fresh water, or having an adequate supply of housing. And on the other hand, the actual empirical patterns of where people are moving to. Many years of migration scholarship tell us that people do not uniformly move away from environmental hazards. There's growing research in the environmental migration scholarship community on immobility in the face of environmental hazards that document the many reasons why people actually remain in place. So even when people do leave environmentally hazardous areas, the environmental characteristics of their destinations are often not found to be major determinants of why they moved there. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So I'm of the mind that we need more focused research on this empirical question of when we see people move as a result of environmental change, where are they actually moving to? And we argue that migration systems literature, which is cited here, help us answer this question and build out a more robust approach to receiving communities research. This area of scholarship examines the networks of places that are tied together through flows of migrants. So each place, to the extent that it sends or receives migrants, is connected to this broader constellation of geographies. By looking at an entire migration system, we can then see how many geographically distant places could be considered receiving communities and may be influenced by environmental changes that are happening far away. So just as an example shown here, if we anticipate that sea level rise along coastal California may influence people living in those places to relocate, we can look at historic outmigration from this region to predict where these people may go. These 18 counties alone are already tied to 650 other counties through outmigration flows, illustrating how large the potential set of receiving communities can become if defined through a migration systems lens. So lastly, I want to really briefly walk through what a migration systems approach can give us in terms of setting priorities for future research directions. First, using a migration systems approach helps us analyze where people empirically are moving to and when they leave a place experiencing environmental change. Second, and more specifically, do we see long-term trends of movement away from places experiencing slower onset hazards like drought, wildfire smoke, or extreme heat? Third, we should be asking whether people are actually moving at higher rates to branded receiving communities and whether the environment is a major factor in drawing them there. It's one thing for those places to be designated by academics or the media as climate havens, but it's a different thing for them to actually experiencing growing levels of in-migration. And finally, historic migration systems have been used to predict future mobility patterns, but we need a better understanding of whether migration systems actually remain stable in the face of environmental change, or whether migration systems may themselves change over time. So for instance, do new migration corridors between places emerge in response to environmental change? If this is the case, past migration systems may be less useful in predicting future receiving communities. So I'm going to wrap up there to give everyone more time, but thank you so much for your attention, and I'll really look forward to the conversation after this. And thank you for your help, folks in the back. Go ahead.
All right. Hello. Are you all awake? Has the coffee kicked in? All right. I'm Kathy Bunting-Howarth. I'm the Associate Director of New York Sea Grant, as well as an Assistant Director of Cornell Cooperative Extension. And today I'm going to talk to you about a project that I did with my Sea Grant buddies. How many of you have not heard of Sea Grant? Okay, we've got a couple. So Sea Grant is a collaborative program between NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, and 34 plus universities across the country. And we fund research of relevance for coastal stakeholders. And then we have a team of extension professionals embedded within communities who then take that research and turn it into tools and products and resources that communities want, need, and hopefully use to make better decisions. So we were leveraging our ability. I'm hitting the button, it's not advancing. We were leveraging our ability to work with researchers and communities, and we applied to NSF for one of the original coastlines and people's research coordination networks to look at just this issue of people moving due to climate change. And being in New York, it's interesting because you have the Atlantic coast, you have coastal subsidence and sea level rise and storm surge, and all of those factors that are leading communities to question whether or not they can live with the water. And we also have the Great Lakes where we have, tons of fresh water. And researchers have started identifying some of these communities as climate havens or potential receiving communities. And so we applied to do this research coordination network where we met regionally, Northeast, Great Lakes, Southeast, Southwest, Northwest, and Alaska, to talk to various stakeholders about what research was needed, what policy is needed, what are the gaps out there? Because when we wrote this proposal, it was 2018, and a lot of the work that you all have done in this audience has happened since then, right? So we wanted to feature the current state of knowledge on climate-induced human mobility, amplify the voices and stories of community members, identify the unique needs of underserved and underrepresented coastal communities, and then in order to identify data gaps, research gaps, try to figure out a framework for conducting use-inspired research, foster education and engagement for building community resilience, and cultivate these networks of interdisciplinary researchers engaged in the study of human mobility. I'm trying, guys. I'm pointing. Okay. So obviously, when people are moving, there are definitely socio-demographic factors that make people feel stuck, right? Or maybe they're involuntarily stranded. So we wanted to make sure we were bringing in researchers that could talk to these things. We wanted to realize that it's not just climate that is influencing whether people move or not, right? You've got those push factors of environmental shocks, wildfires, hurricanes, sunny day flooding, and the pull factors. Like, my family lives there. There's a job there. I can afford housing there. I myself am an economic migrant from the Delmarva Peninsula to Ithaca, New York for a job. So I was really interested in the Great Lakes and being a part of that network and workshop because it's been seen, again, as I said, as a climate destination in a lot of the literature. It's northern, oops, it went backwards. Mild and manageable climate impacts, still going to be a lot of snow in areas, access to fresh water, a lot of vacancy rates, high infrastructure capacity with a desire to grow, and a history or interest in sustainability and resilience. So our idea is to bring together diverse participants, academics, practitioners, folks from local governments, nonprofits, and our fellow Sea Grant folks to learn, first of all, like build a common knowledge, right? We brought in researchers to talk about different case studies. We brought in folks from planning offices to talk about what they'd need. And then have a lot of small group discussion, and finally end with like tons of brainstorming on needs for research, policy, and outreach and education. So we had some case studies to start out with, and some of the takeaways was that small and medium cities with growing populations are likely to become recipient cities and climate destinations. Home buyout programs do not always correlate to a reduction of risk, right? People don't necessarily leave one risky place and go to a non-risky place. And then Great Lakes cities such as Buffalo and Rochester were destinations for those displaced from Hurricane Maria. Actually, more folks from Puerto Rico went to upstate New York rather than the city after Maria. We also talked about the impacts on underserved and under-resourced communities. So some of the takeaways there is that socioeconomic factors make certain populations more vulnerable to extreme heat in the city of Buffalo, and that environmental health capital can be used to advance social and environmental justice in the Great Lakes by enhancing community knowledge, improving existing infrastructure, expanding resources, and increasing political visibility. So making that link between health and environment. We also had 3 identified, whether or not they're self-proclaimed, I would let you have a conversation with them, areas where folks might want to go because of climate change. Duluth, Ann Arbor, and we had someone from the Northwestern Indiana Regional Planning Council. And a lot of folks talked about infrastructure, like we already have failing infrastructure, we need to improve it. We need to adapt to and mitigate some of our own climate impacts and challenges. We'd love some additional research, cost-benefit analyses, and the impact of storytelling. Like these planners realize that telling stories and sharing stories are really important. The other thing is that, okay, you're telling me that people are going to come here, but you're not telling me how many and when. So how am I supposed to go to the folks that answer to the public and the taxpayers and say, we need to invest X dollars because 10,000 people are coming in 2030. Why can't you give me that level of detail? There also is a need for training on climate literacy, policy for sustainable support. You know, obviously people and money, everyone has, especially these days, we have too much to do and too little time. And so the idea that population growth requires regional collaboration too. It might not just be your community, but it could be the county and it could be even a greater region. Then we had this last panel was kind of interesting because we brought in folks from like the Wisconsin department that helps with refugees. We brought in a teacher from Erie, Pennsylvania that works with 80% of his school is English as a second language. We brought in people from state government to talk about water allocation in the Great Lakes. And it was just kind of interesting to hear some of these practical, you know, it's not just about infrastructure. It's not just about transportation. Think about education, think about language and those types of things. So then after folks got to know each other, we started really asking them, where do you think we are in the work now? What parts of a network to discuss these issues are already available? Where do you want to go? And what do you want the network to achieve? So the research group, and this, I'm already starting to see themes, and it's just the beginning of day 2 after a half day yesterday. How do we make the Great Lakes more habitable? For those of you who were at the main session last night, and how is habitable defined? What is the blueprint for planned migration? I think Ira is going to talk about planned retreat, planned. How and why are people moving? How do we better collaborate and incentivize collaboration? And there was this idea for a shared research agenda, continued workshops to facilitate brainstorming in the space, as well as more networks and other resources. In terms of education and outreach, folks wanted us to amplify climate migration through existing structures. Lots of case studies. Case studies are important. To me, it's related to storytelling. Create a platform to share resources and knowledge, you know, coordinate with others in this space, conduct tailored outreach with sending and receiving communities, trying to get communities to talk to each other. Workforce training, again, language and terminology to follow up for Kathryn. That came up time and time again. Help communities recognize and embrace potential challenges and uncertainties. There's a lot of uncertainty in this space, especially if you think you might be attracting people in the future. And to create or adapt ethical guidelines for conducting outreach. And then policy. We were all over the place in the policy workshop. And some of the ideas are here. Create a national level climate policy. We don't have one, do we? Shared definitions of terms. I can't wait. Habitable, receiving community. What do these things mean? We all need to not be talking past each other, but with each other, right? One-stop shop for innovative climate migration policy. Coordination of regional and state priorities, especially in a region like the Great Lakes. If New York State does something and Wisconsin does something else, it's not necessarily going to be sustainable in the long term. We need data and modeling for scenarios for planning. So we have this idea of what the communities are asking for, how many people are coming when. And the idea of having preparedness plans for communities to like pick up if in case they get a sudden influx of migrants. So the implications for future work, climate adaptation planning needs to consider migration. I don't know if the person is in the audience, but I believe they're giving a talk at some point, but they stood up at the end of the workshop and said, I came here because I didn't think this was a discipline in and of itself. I just thought this was another aspect of adaptation. But you guys have convinced me that this is something special that we need to be looking at. So to me, that's a huge takeaway when someone sits with you and people and has that kind of change in thought process. Diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice issues were top in mind of all the participants. We needed more resources for focused follow-up, more networking. Again, the community engaged research aspect. A lot of these communities have been identified in academic papers and were not contacted by the researchers. So they just see this stuff in the newspaper. Where what? So please, 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 if you're doing research and your research isn't going to impact a community, you might want to let them know. And just realize that every region has different capacities, partners, and challenges. And again, we want to work on that common language. So this QR code will take you to the workshop report, which also includes the appendices. It has all of the PowerPoint presentations, and it has all of the raw notes from the breakout. So have a field day. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Kathryn. And give me just one moment while I get my slides going. Just progress. Okay, oh, I see them. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Lian Plass. I go by Lee. I'm with the Urban Land Institute. I'm a senior manager with the Urban Resilience team. I wear a couple of hats. I'm also an adjunct lecturer at Georgetown. I teach GIS and I serve on the American Planning Association's Technology Division Board. So I'm actually here on behalf of ULI specifically, and I'm here to talk to you about our forthcoming report, Receiving Community, Building Inclusive Places That Mitigate Climate Gentrification-Driven Displacement. And for those of you who are not familiar with the organization, ULI is an independent and nonpartisan organization that is singularly focused on impact. ULI's Urban Resilience team specifically works with members from all corners of the real estate industry. And we help to build cities, buildings and communities that are more prepared for the impacts of climate change. Okay. Nice. All right, so I think it's been well established, right, that people are being forced to relocate as a result of climate change impacts. That is a fact. And just pulling out a figure here. So according to the the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in 2020 alone, extreme weather events are estimated to have displaced nearly 31 million people globally. And this figure is anticipated to increase with time. So we're here specifically, though, to I'm here specifically to talk about climate gentrification related concerns. And looking beyond the migration issue, which, well, they're tied together, but so climate gentrification specifically, we're using the definition in our report as it's growing real estate investment and spiking prices for housing and other goods, in addition to residential displacement and demographic changes in areas with lesser exposure to climate change risks. So that's the definition we're working with here in the context of this paper. And when we think about what the impacts are and how that translates, we're looking at things like a rising cost in development, rising taxes in these jurisdictions, declining levels of extensive social cohesion, declining political agency, declining access to employment center and quality jobs, rising cost of rent, changed demand for types of goods and services, and limited access to facilities and services. So these are some of the ways that climate gentrification might manifest in communities. So for this report specifically, our approach was, it began, of course, with literature review, extensive literature review, and then we followed up with our members and folks who are located within the communities that are anticipated to be or are actively being impacted by this phenomenon. And through those conversations, right? And we are as an organization, we are real estate focused. So we're interviewing people on the development side, on the investment side, insurance side, like the analysis and modeling side of the coin, in addition to the public officials and the local community-based organizations, just to get an idea as to how folks are tackling this issue, what the understanding is throughout the real estate sector more generally. And we were looking to try to address a few issues, and those would be so what exactly is climate gentrification in these contexts? How is it manifesting? How does it occur, and how do you identify it? And how do you even begin to tackle the issues? So sourcing solutions, getting feedback in that way. So I want to just take a moment to summarize what we learned from that process before I dive into some of the specific solutions we've identified. And we found that, climate gentrification, and this is something that I think is being echoed in a lot of the talks that we've heard yesterday and today. Well, this is the first talk today, but what we started to hear is that, it happens for a lot of different reasons, and it can occur as a result of movement at many different scales. That could be international migration, it could be interstate, it could be intercounty, it could be with intercity, and it could be even more small. It can be even smaller scale than that. So we're seeing this, and we're also seeing this this underlying issue, right? There's a disparities that are inherent in communities where there are folks who have less opportunity. They're experiencing a change in their neighborhood. There's a change in community dynamics, declining access to resources, and that's not just transportation mobility. We're talking about affordable goods and services, and so these are things that are all contributing to the emergence of the gentrification. And so in order to address it, we're going to need to try to define some indicators, both communities and other key actors throughout the real estate sector. So this is public and this is private as an issue. And they need to be monitored over time, and they need to be analyzed in order to define what the appropriate interventions are given the community context. And so this is a point that I really wanted to call out, which is the fact that, investment in equitable and inclusive development is a profitable venture. And it's not necessarily something that needs to be undertaken exclusively by folks on the private sector, or excuse me, rather on the public sector, for provision of things like affordable housing or other key resources. That's not something that necessarily needs to be provided exclusively by one entity. And so that brings me to my point here, which is so addressing climate gentrification is not something that can be done purely through government policy or an investment strategy or grassroots initiatives. It needs to be a coordinated effort on all of these fronts. And I wanted to outline some of the solutions that or strategies that we'd identified in the report through our outreach efforts. And I'm going to outline them really quickly verbally now, and we're going to slowly go through them, and I'll give you a few examples in the next few minutes. So starting with that outline, right? We noted that it's important to facilitate climate conscious local capacity building, enhance neighborhood stability through pathways to ownership and equity, preserve and expand availability of resilient market rate and affordable housing, designate space that is accessible and relevant, apply design standards that contribute positively to the health and well-being of tenants and community residents, and finally, support retrofit maintenance and disaster recovery. And so up on the screen here are just two of those strategies. We'll be talking explicitly about the climate conscious local capacity building in just a moment. But some of these strategies might look familiar to you if you're in the planning profession or real estate development professions, like the community benefits agreements and the community land trusts and upzoning. And some may not, but they're all measures that can help to mitigate, that we've found can help to mitigate. So up on the screen here is a map of the Miami-Dade, of a portion of Miami-Dade County and possibly a little bit of Broward County. In my previous role, I served as sustainability administrator for the city of North Miami, which is the subject of this case study here. And in the city of North Miami, there's a large Afro-Caribbean population that is anticipated to be displaced by climate gentrification, where folks who are living on the, and let's see if there's a little pointer here. I don't know if there is. Is there? Nope. All right. Well, folks who are anticipated, oh, there's a pointer, along the Federal East Coast Railway that runs along the other side of the intercoastal, yes, very nice. So along the Federal East Coast Railway, there's a significant difference in elevation, which means that that land that is located along that ridge is a little bit less susceptible to flooding, which makes it a little bit more desirable for developers who'd previously prioritized development over on the east side, on the coastal regions of Miami-Dade County, which means that development is slowly moving inland. And the residents of North Miami and others in the Little Haiti community that's shown down below, the label Lemon City, Little Haiti, yep, are being displaced as a result of, in part, the increased desirability of that land because the flooding is less of an issue. And in the Little Haiti neighborhood specifically, that's adjacent to Wynwood, which is a emerging art and design area. So a lot of development drivers there, and in the South Florida region more generally. So getting to the point, Catalyst Miami, which is a local community-based organization founded by an elected official, it's a capacity building organization. And they've been active in the region for some time, but recently they've begun to zero in on this issue of climate gentrification related displacement. And they've launched an initiative called the Community Investment Cooperative within the city of North Miami specifically, to allow the residents of North Miami to own a share or build equity, own a share of a local a property. It's a commercial property, soon to be multiple commercial properties that will enable it will enable folks to build equity within the community and be able to remain there because there is less of a economic stressor for them. So this is one of many initiatives that Catalyst Miami has deployed within the locality, and that commercial building itself will it serves as sort of a community hub. And so Catalyst Miami will conduct activities out of that building, but it will also be a place for local businesses to locate. And I'm personally familiar with the site, and it's in along a commercial corridor near the downtown core. So really, it's quite well positioned, at least in my personal view. Okay, so. And I wanted to just continue down that list of, appropriate measures to address this, the climate gentrification driven displacement issue, and just give you a moment to take a look at this before I progress. Just some more specific interventions before moving on into a second case study, this time in the city of Boston. Oftentimes when we talk about climate gentrification, the East Boston neighborhood shown in the top right-hand corner of this map, it comes to mind. And in that particular neighborhood, I'm not going to get too into it because we're going to be talking about a different Boston neighborhood, but in that neighborhood, you've got new development along the waterfront that is it's built to be resilient, but there is a question as to whether or not the existing residents in that area will be displaced as a result of that new development, as well as other new development planned for the East Boston neighborhood. So the city of Boston actually has some existing programming that's intended to address it by preserving in perpetuity affordable housing and working with some of the local residents in the East Boston neighborhood, not residents, but rather the landowners, small landowners in that neighborhood to preserve units. But I wanted to focus on a case study that we've sort of outlined in the report on the DSNI, which is the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. And the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative is actually located, it's located in the Dudley Street, in the Dudley Street neighborhood, which is, it's in between the Roxbury and Dorchester, like the official neighborhood bounds. And for this initiative, back in the 1980s, this particular part of the city, which is a large Black population, had experienced just some adverse conditions, and so they created in the 1980s a cooperative that allowed for it basically allowed residents to maintain the properties and develop them according to this organization in partnership with and funded in part by the city of Boston. And what it allowed it to do, and today there's a motley of new development that is like managed by the cooperative that is contributing to creating a sense of place, creating community programming, all sorts of really positive activities, including a greenhouse, charter school, parks, town common. So it's I really encourage you to check it out independently because there's some really gorgeous photos, informative maps, and actually documentary material on the subject. So. But in the interest of time, I'm going to have to move along. This is the final slide with the strategies, but I want to pause here to just highlight one thing, which is that, we talk about like the work that the public sector can do, what policies can be passed, what funding, what grant funding can be allocated, but we don't talk enough about what other actors can do. And we also talk about the grassroots initiatives and how communities can can galvanize and work with local governments, but there's a lot of potential from the private sector to contribute to that. And it can be through active engagement, through things like community benefits agreements, et cetera, through constructing new affordable housing that is also resilient, recognizing that these communities are not necessarily exempt or free of any sort of climate change related impacts, as we talked about briefly in the previous session, or sorry, in the previous presentation. So just things to think about. And I'll close with this this last bit here, which is if you're interested in learning more about how climate how to move forward with development and climate resilient development. We've actually published a few reports on the subject, including this climate migration report here, the Reshaping the City report, and the Social Spaces report, which address in more detail some of the topics that I covered briefly during this talk just now. So thank you guys so much for your time, and I hope you found this presentation informative.
Good morning. My comments this morning will preview a forthcoming article on receiving communities in the Environmental Law Institute's Environmental Forum. And it draws upon a process that Adaptation Leader launched over a year ago, focusing on the policy and governance considerations for receiving communities. Let's see if this works. Okay, we'll speed through the infomercial. Adaptation Leader is a 501c3 organization with a mission of raising literacy on adaptation and resilience across all stakeholder groups. I won't read our various focus areas, but most relevant for this conference and this session would, of course, be community level resilience. About me, in brief, my career has focused on environmental regulatory innovation. I've worn a variety of hats across the sustainability universe, and I've been totally immersed for the last 15 years in the adaptation space, and I've led initiatives on adaptation in the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, the American Bar Association, ISO Geneva, International Platform on Adaptation Metrics. This Friday, I'll be moderating a session for Arise US, which focuses on resilience and emerging tech through the Climate Chain Coalition, as in blockchain. Okay, the kinds of things that Adaptation Leader is concerned about include things that we view as significant gaps from another arena entirely, but also related to adaptation. We're very concerned that, for example, the Securities and Exchange Commission proposed rule on climate disclosure has very little to say about adaptation and resilience. And so we're trying to do something about that. More to the point, for us in this room, we're also very concerned about the inevitable internal displacement of domestic populations. While even last night, Alex Halliday alluded to the enormity of the managed retreat challenge. And we've seen an increased interest in managed retreat over the last 6 years, including the series of Columbia events. The reality, as practitioners and policymakers know, is that managed retreat is still not accepted. It's resisted. It's resisted even in those jurisdictions where consideration is mandated. But fortunately, as this conference shows us, there are many talented people bringing their insights to bear on managed retreat. Receiving communities, however, has received much less attention. We view receiving communities, maybe perhaps a little glibly, as the back end or the flip side of managed retreat. We don't believe we can discuss one without the other, and that there's an urgent need to plan for climate displacement in the US. So what are we up to? We feel there's a need for a coherent research and policy agenda that realistically considers the scenarios and options for a potential range of climate-induced displacement of populations within the United States. Underscore within the United States. That we are not in our process looking at the international or cross-border dimension. We're not focused on the temporary or reactive relocations. We acknowledge, but we're not focused on the individual or household level decisions occurring now, nor are we focused on the ad hoc or the voluntary. I need 3 hands. So right now, I think it's fair to say receiving communities status can be described as a trickle. And there is a lot of work, a lot of attention being paid to what is happening with communities that have positioned themselves willingly or unwillingly for but we really don't know what's happening out there. We know it's happening, but it's difficult to monitor because no one I'm sorry. Okay, so difficult to monitor the current trickle. There's mixed reactions at this point. There are mayors who are welcoming the notion of becoming a receiving community. But if you dig down deeper and look at letters to the editor in local newspapers, you will see there's lots of fear out there about what may come. So we haven't really considered the magnitudes of greater displacement to come. Many of you may be familiar with the number that Matt Howard tossed out there in 2017 of 13.4 million displaced in the US on the East Coast only from sea level rise. So he very carefully explained that that's not the full picture. That's just East Coast and that's just sea level rise. So there's a lot more to take into account. And that number of 13.4 million is often cited, but it's not really well understood in terms of developing strategy, policy, and governance. So what will be the game plan when the trickle becomes a flood, and what knowledge and experiences can we draw upon? In our process, which we launched last year, I won't read this whole thing. We formed an interdisciplinary working group. We have a call to action article forthcoming in the Environmental Forum. I'm here today to give you a snapshot of what we've been up to. Where are we going? We're linking up with collaborating organizations and initiatives with an eye toward creating a draft research and policy agenda, and then ultimately convene a stakeholder event with collaborating partners to vet that research and policy agenda. We're not waiting for governmental entities to move on this. We are convening a range of stakeholder organizations to start to give some thought that is urgently needed for the inevitable. So what are we building on? What can inform us? Well, many of you in the room are familiar with the new Jake Biddle book, The Great Displacement, the Rob Verchick book, Octopus in the Parking Lot. If you haven't read those, you should. Real eye-openers for many, including in the climate change discourse. But there hasn't been enough. The two federal level reports most frequently cited from GAO and the White House really didn't address domestic receiving communities. Opinions may differ, but the experiences in Newtok and Ile de Jean Charles, while well studied, probably not replicable at scale. Katrina, Maria, Sandy, the recovery from that, those were reactive, those were temporary. And yes, there are some lessons to be learned from the diaspora of people who did not return to their homes after those events. But that is not a strong basis for further consideration of receiving communities either. Also, as you've already heard today, there's a lot of attention to buyouts and also others focused on flood insurance. Our process does not view those to be likely sustainable solutions. In fact, on the insurance side, we're more concerned about how we're going to maintain insurance markets in the transition period between the trickle and the flood. And finally, prior mass relocations in American history, the Great Migration from the South, the Dust Bowl, these were not models to emulate. So we really can't rely too much on that. So where are we now? We acknowledge that those communities that are viewing themselves as receiving communities have been taking what I call an assessment or a task force approach. These are well accepted building blocks and very necessary for reviewing current vulnerabilities and for planning purposes. But does that help us operationalize policy and governance? Well, not yet, not so far. Where do we need to start? Well, the good news is, even though we're at the beginning, there is some consensus forming, and I was pleased to see one of the earlier presentations also alluding to the same two articles that have pointed the way forward and moving us toward consensus on typologies and scenarios. If you haven't read those two articles, you should. And Hannah Teicher is here, an excellent brand new piece. But we need to take it from there with more sophisticated thinking on context, scale, timelines, and uncertainties. We also need to change our mindset. To the extent that people are talking about moving displaced populations, there's been a sense that we're talking about just moving the people and looking for housing. That's not the total picture. We need to be thinking about bundling or packaging people and their livelihoods. That is going to inform the next phase. So what are we going to need? I think it's clear that we need to contemplate new processes and institutions at the governance level, and even in the broader policy arena here in the United States. we're not real good at dealing with multi-level governance or multi-stakeholder processes. We're going to have to up our game on that. And experimentation is going to be necessary. We can learn from both successes and failures. There's going to be need for a wide range of pilot projects to explore different options for receiving communities. There'll be a need for different vehicles at different levels of scale, different vehicles, different mechanisms. At the local level, there has been discussion and exploration of opportunity and innovation zones. I would like to suggest that we can borrow the concept of sister cities. Cities not necessarily in the same state that can create a mechanism. Yes, there are regional climate compacts, for example, in South Florida, but I'm talking here about extending that notion as a governance approach for receiving communities. Interstate cooperative agreements may be necessary when the trickle becomes a flood. And although I started by saying we're interested in displacement of populations within the US, and we weren't interested in cross-border climate refugee issues, the asterisk next to that in my earlier slide was the reality is that we're going to have to be looking at the movement of US residents beyond our northern border into Canada. So a bilateral treaty with Canada is something that we need to start thinking about. Diving deeper and more narrowly on one topic that we intend to pursue is the question of federal law, policy, and regulation. And each one of these is a serious area of law, and as applied to receiving communities, as we like to say in the legal community, issues of first impression. And a couple of them on this list, including takings and freedom of movement, those are constitutional issues. So very little thought has been given to any of these at this point as related to receiving communities. And we intend to pursue that further as our process continues this year. And the forthcoming article talks about a number of other concepts and approaches that we can borrow from other arenas and explore and apply to receiving communities. In the typologies discussion mentioned earlier, there's not only the temporal issue of near-term trickle versus longer time horizon flood, but also it can't be a cookie cutter approach. There need to be different approaches for how we utilize existing urban areas, for example, in Rust Belt cities that have been hollowed out, versus what are the criteria that might be needed in establishing greenfield locations. In going back to the previous slide, because I zipped through that pretty quickly, private property versus federal property. When we're talking about greenfield locations, how do we avoid the takings issue? Well, how the use of federal land may be an option, and there's been very little serious attention paid to the use of federal land for such purposes. Another area of research that I've explored in other settings is labeled as intentional communities. Some of you may have heard of transition towns, others may have heard of eco-villages. The overall grouping is intentional communities. That could be a source of information for how we establish receiving communities, whether in existing urban areas in particular zones or in greenfield locations. Going back to my mention of bundling people and livelihood, the private sector is going to have to play a big role in this going forward. That goes to the livelihood level, whether it's at the company level, the sector level, or a national industry policy level. The role of the private sector is going to loom large when we're talking about displacement at this level of magnitude. In the next bullet, I'll just briefly mention, although this could be a conference in itself, we are all sensitized to the need to pursue managed retreat and receiving communities through an equity lens. We really need to bring to the table those in the behavioral sciences who have looked at areas such as social cohesion, which was studied to some degree post-Sandy, and also how outside of the climate context, in-migration has been dealt with by existing communities. And the final concept I'll leave you with is that we see a role for boundary organizations. For those of you not familiar with that notion, those are third-party neutral multi-stakeholder coordination organizations. And we suggest that such boundary organizations can position themselves in this receiving community space to coordinate at different levels of scale and function as a climate broker. So with that, I've raised more questions than I've answered, but that was intentional. And I hope that you will join us as we move forward. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, all, for being here. I'm going to try to wrap this session up very briefly, given the remaining time. My name is Linda Shai. I'm an assistant professor at Cornell's Department of City and Regional Planning, and I have the pleasure of sharing a project that we have been working on for the last year called NOAA Nests. This is funded by NOAA's Climate Policy Office. I hope I'm getting that right, CPO. And they fund all sorts of RISAs. Historically, they're now called CAPS, Climate Adaptation Partnerships, to support multi-state regions in advancing work on adaptation across the science and social science and practitioner interface. And so a while ago, they realized, or Congress mandated, that these RISAs or CAPS have to cover the entire country. And so they've expanded into more sections of the country. And so we received a one-year planning grant to consider what that would look like for the upper Northeast, and taking into account in particular the climate migration questions. So this is across all of these different states, focusing on the non-metro areas, and it involved people from 8 different universities. A lot of our members are here today. I see Susie Moser and Judy East, and a number of my students who are on the job market are here. So do consider talking with them. So, sorry, I keep using the. All right, so we had multiple research questions, and they focused around what will migration look like, climate migration for this region? To what extent do policies actually consider these issues? How do the social differences shape the vulnerability and perceptions of climate migration? And what are the regional governance gaps in order to anticipate and deal with these challenges? So I'll just go through this really, really quickly. And the first thing to realize about this region, as we've gone through this kind of a literature review process and an engagement process, is that migration isn't new to this region. It has come and gone in many different ways, but always it has led to greater inequality. So starting with colonialism and the genocide of the indigenous peoples, through Irish and German immigration, there was a great migration in this region. Actually, it was not of African Americans. It was first considered of French Catholic Quebecois, and there was the KKK arose to fight them. And then later on, when Jews and others came, it was like, okay, well, we're going to shift attention to new groups to be against, right? So there's always been a lot of people coming and going, and it's not that this region can't accommodate more people, but it's a question of if more people were to come, how can actually this kind of demographic change lead to greater equity rather than, once again, greater inequities? We did some studies on migration, and this is also the oldest and the whitest part of a country. It has been seeing shrinking populations for some time. Where there has been immigration where there has been population growth, it's almost entirely been as a result of in-migration because the aging population is past their greatest childbearing years. And so this is a place where this question of demographics plays in really interestingly, because a lot of places are no longer used to what it means to grow. And they are not geared in their governance, in their building construction and other kinds of systems to actually anticipate and imagine what growth would mean for these places. So there's lots of case studies here. I'll just very quickly zip through them, and so migration, many people have touched on the fact that migration is not about climate migration only. Even if you're pushed out of a place because of climate reasons, you're not necessarily drawn to places because of climate change. There was a map that I deleted, but it showed how the places that the EPA has mapped as the most resilient counties in the country due to climate change and governance and all sorts of things are really pretty much the opposite of where people have been moving to. And so even now we have another study that's been mapping in California at the census tract level, the different hazards and the migration rates. And it's almost like the more disasters you experience in your census tract in a year, the more in migration you have the following year. So people are not making rational choices about this. And that's really important to consider. Just because the Northeast has a lot of the benefits of climate qualities doesn't mean that people actually will come. And so there is this hunger for information, but actually modeling that and projecting that is going to, I think, really be very, very difficult. And maybe not even that necessary, but we can think about it without that data, right? So people are already moving. There's a lot of retirees coming into places like Stonington. The key fact here to point out, they went from 3 Airbnbs to 292 in just 6 years. And that's competing for all the affordable housing that's already tight in this market. So whether or not people are doing this because of climate reasons, the housing crisis is already affecting these places, and their inability to deal with that now is going to affect their inability to deal with any kind of climate migration that might happen in these places. In Lewiston, these are some of the more positive aspects here. You could say that this was a census tract or a community that was one of the poorest, and 8 years later it was deemed all-American city. And a lot of that was due to a significant increase in Somali migration. And the Somali migrants in turn were pushed out of Portland, which said, we don't have any more capacity, go somewhere else. And so they were pushing people out of Portland and into places like Lewiston. And it has been really challenging to integrate Muslim, African, international people whose first language is not English. But there are many interesting aspects where you're also seeing businesses saying that there needs to be cultural education, not just for people who are moving in, but for the people who are already there in order to become welcoming members of the community. We see in Rochester a lot of migration, and I think this story of how there was, migration from Puerto Rico in the 1960s has really paved the way for more Puerto Ricans after Hurricane Maria to see Rochester and Buffalo as places that they would naturally want to move to, and for the local population to have the understanding, language, cultural institutions in order to be welcoming communities. But that's a story that's been 60 years in the making, and so it's recognizing that in order for this is not just like we are welcoming now, and climate migration is like, what kind of things can we seed institutionally now that will prepare us for things that are happening many decades into the future. And I think it's interesting to look at this case study because so much of our climate migration and the projections and the modeling and the demography really focuses on individual choices of when to move. And as everybody has said, they're irrational creatures, or we are irrational creatures, and it's hard to determine what makes us move. But very few studies, I think, are looking at when businesses are going to choose to move. And when major businesses move, those are going to have thousands of people's impacts in terms of jobs. So micro Micron is building a huge new factory, 9,000 jobs just of that factory itself, which means that multiplier effects, tens of thousands of jobs and housing and things are going to be created. So when our business is going to move, what choices are going to influence where they go? Because that's then going to drive a lot of the individual choices about where people want to go. And then let me just, Buffalo is a terrific case. Let me just skip it in the interest of time. So what have we learned from this project? We did a lot of listening sessions in the different subregions, and Susie Moser organized these for us. So we considered these different scenarios of what it would mean to be prepared or not prepared. What if people come, or what if they don't come? And what is that going to mean? And so let me just say, there's a lot of people moving in and moving out already, and there are a variety of factors of what motivates them to move. And so there is, as you look at some of the lists of who is moving in and who is moving out, there's not necessarily that the people one imagines as a government that you might want to bring in, like the employers, the kind of professional class, the taxpayers. A lot of people who are moving in are the refugees and asylum seekers. They are retirees and not necessarily employment drivers, right? And the people who are moving out are also those who are among some of the most disadvantaged groups and are already being displaced. And that's not necessarily even with climate. That's with COVID. That's with housing affordability. That's with a lot of other things. And so the social issues, as I've been enumerating, really comes back again and again. And because this is one of the whitest regions, it's not always a racial question, although there is race in some of the Rust Belt cities, there are tribal communities. But there are a lot of challenges in terms of class, of urban and rural divisions, of religious differences, of political ideological differences, and a real demand for services that often are neglected when we're talking about how do we adapt our infrastructure plan. So right now, one of my students is looking at mapping all the policies and trying to think about how much do the things that are not climate policies at the state level ever actually think about climate change and climate migration, because those are the things that people care about. So when we code all of the things that we heard, again and again, some of the major themes that come up as being really important are related to housing, to jobs, to their services, including the healthcare services and elder care and childcare services, education and training of the workforce, including a workforce that is able to help build a decarbonized society. The chief climate officer, the climate chief of Massachusetts said Massachusetts is missing 30,000 workers to actually build the decarbonization goals that the state has set for itself. But nobody can actually afford to move to Massachusetts, so the workers are not going to go there. Food security and this kind of sentiment of how do we create the social fabric of a welcoming community. And so it was very interesting that people realized whether or not people are coming, these same issues are problems of our communities, and we have to deal with them for the people who are here now in order for us to become able to deal with them for the people who are going to come. And there are, of course, it's not just going to be the same as usual tackling housing. The climate imperative is part of all of these stories and how we think about them, but they are far beyond the kinds of narrow prescriptions around how we think about adaptation in many of the places that we're thinking about. So to have some takeaways here, it's to say that climate migration, we basically went through a learning process of the past year, and our learning takeaways here are that climate migration is not certain. Whether you're touting yourself as being a Duluth or a Buffalo as a climate receiver community, it's not clear that people actually will come. And so that is a kind of liberating sense for some people, right? If you want them to come, you're going to actually have to work for it to happen. And if you didn't want it to happen, well, they might not be there, right? So I think there's a lot of agency in terms of what communities want to do to prepare themselves and how they want to prepare themselves, how they want to anticipate that. That this climate migration also is not and should not be considered as a new issue, notwithstanding the conference here and all of our desires to be like experts of a new field, that these are really, we have to join the people who have been fighting for housing, for food security, for livelihoods, for all of these things for a long time. And we need to join their movements to help advance them, not necessarily just asking them to join our particular interests and movements. Social differences around migration underlie all the conflicts that we have for land use, for permitting, for jobs, for housing, but we rarely actually talk about them openly. We really do more technical analyses, and these kinds of fears and prejudices and anger and resentment and prejudices, we don't really open space for that. So cultivating, I think, a skill to be the space to have it and the skill to facilitate those kinds of difficult conversations is a key piece of building that governance capacity. And finally, that we have tried to learn from each other and to create these conversations of why is Maine in conversation with Buffalo? Like, should we be talking about this? And so I think that this is showing that even there are cities that are similar across the region. There are rural areas that share similarities across the region. There's opportunities for state collective action in this region. And so right now we're putting forward an NSF grant, another planning grant. We never get serious money, I guess. But this grant, we did a quick scan and found that there are like over 4 dozen organizations, research entities in the Northeast area that look at housing, governance, economic development, and health. So we don't need another center to help us do something. We actually have to get all of these places talking about each other, because the things that we are saying, that we need a one-stop institutional shop where you can say, if we want to create transformative climate justice communities that are adapted and decarbonized, what should we do and how should we do it? There is no single research institution that can actually answer that question, because we ourselves are very siloed and divided geographically, scale level topics. And so we're suggesting that as a research community, we have the need to help actually build that institutional capacity to do the work that we are talking about. So with that, thank you very much and look forward to talking with you.
All right, thank you guys for your patience, cooperation. We're gonna have a quick couple of minutes for a Q&A presentation. So if all the speakers would go to the front, please. So who would start off the Q&A? Yeah.
Question for all of you. You all seem to be very functional government. Scenarios, you go to consider having something less functional, even in places like the United States.
Well, I'm certainly not assuming a functional government. I'm assuming that we have nothing in terms of longer term strategy, policies, and institutions. So I would push back on your first point.
There's assuming there's a body that's willing to make policies. We'll ask them to come to the future, even if we don't have them then. But I'm not so sure what you think. So how do we deal with this without that actually from any level of government, federal, state, and
Hi, I think I can speak a little bit to this from some of my experience down at the local government level. Really often, and particularly in South Florida communities, you might not see a ton of action maybe at some of the higher up levels within the state, but down at the local level where the community members and the direct stakeholders are feeling the impacts, there's a really strong impetus for taking action. What that action is and whether or not it's appropriate is something that we can as an academic community and as a research institution, like we can offer recommendations on what is appropriate, and that's really sort of the part of the picture, part of the path forward. So, understanding that, every community is different. Every community has its own unique context, and, from a local government perspective, giving them the grace to incorporate those changes is going to be kind of important. But, to the extent that we can offer guidance and at least a menu of options, I think that's, probably a good step in the right direction.
I would say that's why we looked at not just policy, but research needs as well as education and outreach needs, because it's you're right, political will is extremely important. And so if there is no will, there's no way, right? Unless we have these bottom-up efforts. I mean, think about it, in 2016, we left the Climate Paris Accords, but cities and individuals and NGOs came forward and said, we're still in. And so I think people and communities, regardless of how functioning their government is or well-resourced, as long as you have some hope and are willing to talk to people and listen to people and learn from each other, there are possibilities for policies to come to fruition.
She said it so well. I'm just going to leave it there.
But Linda, you're my idol. I must hear you.
I guess if I said, no, it's unfair. I gave you this question last night over dinner, and because I didn't have an answer, now you're asking me. I think if we just left it as it is and assumed it isn't going to work, that's the baseline assumption. So anything that we do is going to make it better than it is. There is variation. They are not uniformly basket cases. And I also work on receiving communities in the upper Northeast because we have more functional governments, I think. So it's able to be more hopeful. And insofar there is dysfunction, it's because people disagree, and they disagree because fundamentally we're not talking to each other. And we have these things that you can only resolve by talking to each other. So the more we can facilitate that around things that people actually care about, the more likely they might actually work together effectively. So.
The last thing I would add quickly is that I think there's two ways of approaching thinking about receiving communities. One, what characteristics of a place, so including the government structure of that place, would make a good receiving community. And then the other way of approaching it is examining where people actually are moving to, and then defining receiving communities based on where we see people arriving. And so I think you could study where people are arriving and ask questions about that, regardless of what the government structure is in their destination.
That education is part of, or dissemination of this information is crucial to preparing grounds. Since yesterday, I'm looking around for community organizations or people. I thought that for every paying customer here, there should have been a community organization invited, or somebody from office should be invited to hear this conversation that's ongoing. They don't know, and then it just as you said, information is then read in the newspaper, and they say, "Oh no way, not with me." We plan to disseminate the highly academic research paper to a layman.
That's what my team does throughout New York State and all the Sea Grant extension folks and land grant. And so that's one of the reasons why we've started not only looking at climate adaptation, but at the mobility aspects of it. And so it's about creating, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, it's about working with communities and generating trust and providing people information in a way that they can grasp it and understand it. And so that's why we like to partner with researchers and the guy on the street and the guy with the power of the purse, right? And try to get people, we'd like to be the table around which people can come and discuss these issues. And so there are people out there that are, their job is to translate.
I have a follow-up question to that. So, when you talk about receiving communities, talking about space, it's because that people have and how it's going to get structure, jobs, and I think whether we treat it or not, those are rights that people have, and wherever they should live, what the policy implications are for creating it, whether that's an opportunity or not, as aim for receiving communities in the one place.
Thanks for your question, Erica. I actually think one way of approaching this issue is to not describe places as receiving communities and to instead just put resources very broadly towards population change and towards the housing crisis. And I think that some of like your points you raised at the end, Linda, speak to this, and some of the tools that you described, Liana, like these are tools that we have in our toolkit to address urbanization trends and population trends already. And so part of me wonders, what do we gain actually by labeling communities in this way? And I hope to continue having that conversation with you all.
I'm actually going to chime in here really quick because we explicitly did not call out potential locations of like, you know, where people might go in our report because we didn't want to create any kind of stigma for communities that might not necessarily want to be assigned a label. And so just being conscious of that local context and how it'll be received in the different community contexts is it was sort of central to the way that we approached, you know, the recommendations that we outlined. Like this is a menu of options for you. This is how it's been implemented in different communities from different stakeholders in the real estate sector, but we're not necessarily saying this is something that should be applied in your community specifically because you are a receiving quote unquote community.
Yeah.
Right, this question for me, you mentioned, and actually several of you guys have mentioned the need for public-private investment. And just last week, there was a whole discussion about environmental social governance or ESG in the financial world. And they're all looking for this kind of, that they need this kind of credits to offset their own carbon stuff in the market. So I'm wondering if you guys actually have any specific companies that you're already working with in that regard, whether this is for hey, let's do public-private.
So this report actually is a grant-funded initiative, and so we're not working directly with any specific partners for this forthcoming report on climate gentrification. But some of our other publications on the subject of climate risk disclosure have been was actually funded by LaSalle Investment Management, and we have a couple of other reports that were in partnership, I think, with Heitman, a series actually on climate gentrification. It's not gentrification, climate migration. And investment decision making. So we are working with folks who are in the real estate sector to try to understand this issue, and not just folks who are internal to the firm, but also to our membership base. So reaching out more broadly across the industry.
2 quick points on that question. Where this crosses over to ES&G in the financial sector has more to do not with carbon credits, but with disclosure that companies are going to need to make pretty soon relating to their transition plans. For those not familiar, TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, that lays out the approach for physical and transition risks. When the SEC final rule comes out, and even if it doesn't, European rules are already talking about having publicly held companies lay out their transition plans. And no, this isn't, hey, public-private partnerships would be a good idea. I think the Micron example of the public sector, private sector role is evidence that this is going to be coming. There are going to need to be incentives for public-private partnerships in a coherent strategic manner, as I mentioned in my presentation. And again, one basic problem in talking about public-private partnerships in the United States is that there are too many different definitions of public-private partnerships. There are partnerships and partnerships. That's a title of an article I wrote. There are multi-stakeholder collaborations, and there are contractual vehicles and a whole continuum in between. So when we're talking about public-private partnerships, we need to be really explicit about how they're going to be used.
So we are running a bit out of time. So I would just like to say the questions that are being brought up in the chat we have a question by Jessica Lee Antropont for Kathryn Bunting-Howarth. You mentioned GEDI was top of mind. So were things like the political climate, trans inclusive policy, abortion rights, less racist policing, and the potential receiving community included as potential factors in the decision-making of climate migrants?
I would refer the person to the workshop report to see the notes. We were talked about all kinds of social factors and the breakout groups in terms of things that would attract or detract various populations in different areas.
All right. Well, thank you. That is all the time that we have for questions. I would just like to give another round of applause for these amazing presenters. Thank you all.